Black smoke twisted over Battleship Row as torpedoes ripped steel. Japanese pilots radioed triumph. They believed America's Pacific Fleet lay broken. What mattered most was absence. No fleet carriers were in port. Enterprise steamed back from Wake, Lexington, operated near Midway, and Saratoga sat at San Diego. That gap would reshape the war. Within 4 years, the United States would launch an armada of Essex-Class carriers, transforming a tiny force into Japan's nightmare. Pre-war Japanese Naval Staff College lecturers emphasized, "Carriers are eyes and claws, but the battleship delivers the killing blow." In the late 1930s, Japan's Navy stood at the forefront of carrier aviation. Akagi and Kaga, rebuilt from earlier hulls, could launch dozens of aircraft at once. Newer ships, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were among the most modern carriers afloat. Yet doctrine still placed these ships in a supporting role. The Kantai Kessen, or decisive battle concept, guided the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN. Planners envisioned luring the U.S. Pacific Fleet westward, exhausting it with submarines and cruisers, and finally annihilating it in a climactic gun duel fought under Yamato's 18-inch rifles. Carriers were valued for reconnaissance and initial strikes, but always as precursors to the battleship's thunder. Here lay the irony. The Navy that pioneered the carrier strike at Pearl Harbor still chained its doctrine to battleships. Admi Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, stood apart. A veteran of Washington conferences, he knew America's industrial depth and doubted Japan could win a long war. He wagered instead on shock. To Yamamoto, concentrated carriers offered the only chance to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the outset. Thus emerged Kido Butai, the world's first operationally massed carrier strike force. Under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 6 carriers trained to launch hundreds of aircraft in coordinated waves. Yamamoto's insistence on mass, not dispersal, made Pearl Harbor possible. Yet even Yamamoto's boldness existed inside a framework still oriented toward the decisive surface battle. Nagano Osami, chief of the Naval General Staff, continued to see carriers as an opening weapon, not a war-winning tool in themselves. By December 1941, Japan's carrier order of battle was formidable. Kido Butai's 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku. Other carriers in service, light carriers Ryujo, Zueho, Hosho, plus the seaplane carrier Chitose, later converted. Depending on classification, Japan fielded -10-11 operational carriers, United States carriers, 7 fleet carriers worldwide. Ranger Atlantic, Yorktown and Hornet, Atlantic until spring 1942, plus Pacific fleets, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga. WASP rotated between Atlantic and Mediterranean duties. Thus, at the moment of Pearl Harbor, the balance seemed tilted toward Tokyo. Japanese officers viewed America's carrier force as both numerically smaller and doctrinally untested. The Japanese staff officers wrote candidly before the war, "The Americans will be slow to replace heavy ships," one planner noted in a 1940 memorandum, extending that logic to carriers. U.S. shipyard mobilization was underestimated. Japanese admirals imagined a war of 2 or 3 years, ending before America's industry could tip the balance. In this mindset, dismissing America's tiny carrier fleet seemed rational. U.S. carriers were real, but not decisive, at least not in Japanese eyes. Surviving summaries of the Naval Staff College lectures reinforce this worldview. Carriers were described as advance guards, tasked to soften the enemy fleet before the main event. Combined fleet operational plans for 1941 likewise projected that carrier raids would prepare the conditions for the Yamato and Musashi to deliver the finishing blows. These records, while paraphrased, show how doctrine lagged behind innovation. The contrast was stark. Doctrine, Battleship primacy. Carriers as scouts and attritional tools. Practice under Yamamoto. Massed carrier striking power, capable of crippling a fleet in one blow. This duality ran straight through Japanese planning on the eve of Pearl Harbor. It is crucial not to conflate roles. The true capital ships of carrier warfare, capable of 70-90 aircraft. Faster, smaller complements like Ryujo or Zueho, typically 30-40 aircraft. Mostly American, used later in the war for convoy escort and amphibious support. When Japanese officers dismissed U.S. numbers, they often blurred categories or ignored distinctions. America's handful of fleet carriers seemed negligible when measured against the IJN's 6 giants concentrated in Kido Butai. One common misreading is that Yamamoto himself was skeptical of carriers. In fact, he was their foremost champion among Japan's admirals. His push to mass 6 carriers for Pearl Harbor was radical, against institutional inertia. The true conservatism lay in the broader staff's adherence to decisive battle doctrine, not in Yamamoto's own view. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, Japanese admirals still laughed at America's supposed weakness. Their own doctrine said the battleship remained king, their carrier strike a clever but temporary tool. Yamamoto, sensing the future, massed flat tops into Kido Butai anyway. The irony was already forming. The very weapon Japan dismissed as secondary would be the instrument of its undoing. Oil fires roared across Battleship Row while Enterprise and Lexington steamed at sea, and Saratoga sat refitting in San Diego, leaving carriers as the Pacific Fleet's only striking arm overnight. On the morning of 7 December 1941, the backbone of America's Pacific Fleet lay shattered. Battleships like Arizona and Oklahoma burned or capsized. West Virginia and California settled into the mud. Nevada tried to run for open water and beached herself. Admin. Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, stared at wreckage that rendered the Kantai-Kassen battle model of America's answer to Japan's battleships impossible. The only capital ships left intact were the carriers. Was returning from ferrying marine aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington, CV-2, operated northeast of Midway. Saratoga, CV-3, fresh from refit, sat at San Diego, preparing to steam west. Their survival was not strategy, it was accident. Yet that accident changed the balance of the war. Washington moved swiftly. Admiral King, a fiery officer recently appointed Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, Comminch, looked at the wreckage and saw opportunity. With the battleships out, the carriers became not just tools, but the fleet itself. By late December, Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived to assume command as CPAC, relieving Kimmel. He later admitted that he never expected to find such a shambles at the harbor. Yet Nimitz, a submariner by background, instinctively recognized that survival depended on offense. He told King bluntly, America had to keep striking with what remained. Its carriers, invincible commando control areas offered particular utility. Munyen came squeaking out anti-ship battery ports, captured this pivot. Memoranda described immediate carrier raids planned against the Marshalls and Gilberts, not as decisive blows, but as morale and pressure operations. Capt. Mark Mitcher, newly elevated to carrier command, began sketching raids that would carry Enterprise and Yorktown into Japanese-held waters early in 1942. These documents show an astonishing speed of adaptation. Within days of Pearl Harbor, the Navy shifted doctrine from battleship-centric to carrier-centric, not by choice, but by necessity. In February 1942, Enterprise and Yorktown struck the Marshalls and Gilberts. In March, Lexington raided Lae and Salamaua in New Guinea. These raids inflicted limited material damage but had outsized psychological impact. They showed Japan that the U.S. Navy's striking arm still lived. Most audacious of all was the Doolittle raid, conceived in January and executed in April 1942. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, launched from USS Hornet, CV-8, and struck Tokyo. Though the raid caused little physical damage, its symbolic effect was enormous. It forced Japan to accelerate plans to draw U.S. carriers into battle, a chain reaction leading directly to Midway. Battleships hit at Pearl Harbor. 8. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Battleships hit at Pearl Harbor. 8. Arizona, Oklahoma, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Casualties: 2,403 Americans killed, 1,178 wounded. Surviving carriers: 3. Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, all by chance location. First carrier raids: Marshall Gilbert's, Feb 1942, launched tilde 140 aircraft in scattered strikes. Doolittle raid: 16 bombers, 650 nautical miles from Tokyo. Tokyo radio trumpeted, "The U.S. Pacific Fleet destroyed." Newspapers in Japan depicted Pearl Harbor as final proof of Japanese supremacy. The reality was different. The carriers survived untouched, the repair yards remained operational, and the oil tank farms fueling future campaigns were intact. Within 6 months, those few carriers would engage at Coral Sea and Midway, where the strategic balance began to turn. A persistent myth holds that the Japanese spared America's carriers by not launching a third strike on Pearl Harbor. In fact, they were absent altogether: Enterprise and Lexington at sea, Saratoga in California. Even a third wave would not have found them. Japanese broadcasts in December mocked America's carrier strength. One Tokyo announcer described the U.S. Navy as a headless beast, its wings clipped. In reality, the carriers were not wings, they were the new head. Privately, Japanese planners did not fear a handful of American carriers. They expected attrition to grind down replacements. They underestimated America's industrial potential and failed to grasp how quickly the carriers would become America's central instrument of war. Saratoga's location is often misrepresented as nearby but spared. In fact, she was refitting in San Diego on 7 December. Her absence was geographic, not tactical, but still crucial. When she returned to Hawaii later in December, she brought with her a symbol. Not all was lost. The irony was immediate. In trying to cripple America's battleship fleet, Japan had elevated the very ships it dismissed. With battleships smoldering in the mud, carriers became the tip of the spear. And in King and Nimitz, the Navy had leaders who would wield that spear relentlessly. Radio static hissed across the Pacific in May 1942, 2 fleets groping for each other without ever coming into gun range. In May 1942, the U.S. Navy met the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement where opposing surface forces never sighted one another. Carriers alone decided the clash. Lexington and Yorktown launched strike groups across hundreds of miles, while Shokaku, Zuekeku, and the light carrier Shoho did the same. It was chaotic, blind combat. Aircraft searched vast oceans with nothing but compass headings and radioed bearings. And yet the pattern was clear. Carriers, not battleships, were now the arbiters of naval war. On 7 May, U.S. planes sank the light carrier Shoho in a brutal series of hits. One pilot radioed the now famous phrase, "Scratch one flat top," immortalized in after-action reports. The next day, carrier air groups struck at full force. Lexington absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits and was abandoned after internal explosions. Yorktown was damaged but survived. On the Japanese side, Shokaku was heavily damaged and forced back to Japan. Zuikaku lost much of her air group. The result was technically a Japanese tactical win. They inflicted greater tonnage loss, but strategically it was a check. The invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled. More importantly, the two fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were unavailable for the next great battle, Midway. Even before Coral Sea ended, codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had unraveled Japanese intentions. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team intercepted and decrypted messages indicating that AF was the next Japanese objective. To confirm, they arranged a deception. Midway's garrison sent an uncoded message about water shortages. Soon after, Japanese traffic reported AF is short of water. The ruse worked. Admiral Chester Nimitz seized the chance. With just 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and hastily repaired Yorktown, he would spring a trap on the Kido Butai. Yorktown's damage control miracle. At Pearl Harbor, workers patched her Coral Sea damage in just 72 hours, allowing her to sortie with TF-17 in time. Official reports describe 1,400 shipyard workers laboring day and night. Air Group reports. CDR. Wade McCluskey's decision to continue searching after missing his initial contact vector led his dive bombers to stumble upon the Japanese carriers just as their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. On 4 June 1942, Japanese carriers struck Midway itself at dawn, inflicting damage but failing to neutralize the airfield. Nagumo debated launching a second strike. As his crews rearmed planes below decks, U.S. dive bombers appeared overhead. In a matter of minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze by precision dive bombing from Enterprise and Yorktown squadrons. Later that afternoon, Haryu launched counterstrikes that crippled Yorktown, but she too was found and destroyed by the next U.S. wave. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the heart of Kido Butai, were gone. America had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, but the strategic initiative shifted permanently. Entry into the Pacific Theater, subsequently in Coral Sea, Lexington sunk, Shoho sunk, Shokaku badly damaged. Midway. 4 IJN fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Haryu, sunk. 1 U.S. carrier, Yorktown sunk. Japanese casualties, 3,000+ killed, aircrews and ship crew. U.S. casualties, 300 killed. Sortie ranges, carrier strikes launched from 150-200 miles out. Japan still fielded elite aviators, many combat-hardened since 1937 in China. Their attacks on Yorktown were accurate and disciplined. But the U.S. brought something new: code-breaking intelligence, flexible command decisions, and a repair/industrial base that could resurrect ships like Yorktown in days. Coral Sea and Midway proved that tactical brilliance alone could not offset attrition. America could replace ships and crews. Japan could not. Popular memory sometimes paints Midway as pure luck. The truth is more disciplined. Code-breaking gave Nimitz advanced knowledge. McCluskey's decision to continue searching was judgment, not random chance. The timing was fortuitous, but it intersected with Japanese indecision and flawed doctrine. Another caution: much of the popular narrative comes from Mutsuo Fuchida's post-war account, which later historians have flagged as unreliable in details. Modern scholarship urges careful separation of myth from documented action reports. Captured pilots and later Japanese analyses revealed disbelief at America's ability to reconstitute carriers so quickly. At Coral Sea, Zuikaku's air group was gutted. Her pilots could not be replaced rapidly. At Midway, the destruction of 4 fleet carriers left Japan's naval air arm crippled. A post-war Japanese staff study admitted, "Our losses at Midway could not be made good. The carrier war shifted irretrievably to the enemy." Coral Sea checked Japan's southward thrust. Midway annihilated its offensive striking power. In just 2 months, the narrative had reversed. Japan's carrier arm, once the terror of the Pacific, now bled pilots and ships it could never replace. America's tiny fleet of carriers, mocked in 1941, had become the decisive factor. The crucible was complete, the age of the battleship was finished, and the Essex-Class era was about to begin. Between late 1942 and 1944, the U.S. Navy commissioned nearly one new fleet or light carrier every month, an output no Navy in history had ever matched. The shock of Pearl Harbor triggered something Tokyo had underestimated: America's vast industrial base. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months, this was what he feared. The U.S. Navy had planned the Essex-Class before the war, but after December 1941, the program exploded into priority. Unlike Japan, constrained by limited yards and resources, the United States could spread carrier construction across multiple coasts. Shipyards from Newport News, Virginia, to Brooklyn, New York, to Norfolk and Philadelphia laid keels simultaneously. The carrier became not just a ship, but a product of mass assembly. The Essex was designed in the late 1930s as a step beyond the Yorktown class. She was bigger, tougher, and more flexible. Standard displacement tilde 27,000, 127,500 tons. Length tilde 872 feet. Long haul variants stretched past 890. Crew 2,000. 600 officers and men. Air group, initially 90 aircraft. By 1944, fighter-heavy groups sometimes exceeded 100. The class was deliberately designed for adaptability. Unlike Japanese carriers that maximized striking power but sacrificed survivability, the Essex featured a robust, compartmented hull with an armored hangar/strength deck and improved magazine protection. Its flight deck was an unarmored wooden deck over steel, trading armor for aircraft capacity and ease of repair, larger magazines, and redundancy in machinery. Bureau of Ships, BUShips, production tables reveal the rhythm. Contracts placed in 1940-41, keels laid in 1941-42. First units commissioning in late 1942, yard logs show astonishing acceleration. Construction times falling from 36 months for the lead ship to under 24 months for later hauls. At Brooklyn Navy Yard, diaries from foremen record double shifts, floodlit yards, and welders laboring in snow and rain. The urgency was total. The first Essex, CV-9, commissioned in December 1942. By mid-1943, her sisters Bunker Hill and Yorktown, CV-10, joined her. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-class carriers were operational. From then on, they appeared in steady rhythm: Lexington, CV-16, Intrepid, CV-11, Hornet, CV-12, Franklin, CV-13, and more. By VJ Day, 17 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned, with 14 seeing combat. By 1950, 24 were completed in total. The Essexes didn't fight alone. To accelerate carrier numbers, the U.S. converted Cleveland-class light cruisers into Independence-class light carriers, CVLs. These carried about 30 aircraft each, were fast enough to operate with the fleet, and filled gaps until the Essexes arrived. Meanwhile, the U.S. mass-produced escort carriers CVEs on merchant hulls. These smaller ships, nicknamed Jeep carriers, proved crucial for convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, and close air support in amphibious invasions. Role clarifier: the Essex-class were the true fleet carriers, CV. CVLs were complements, CVEs auxiliaries. By mid-war, the U.S. Navy wielded all three in harmony, something Japan never achieved at scale. 17 Essexes commissioned during WHI-14 saw combat, 24 Essex, total by 1950. Air Group, 9,100 planes, fighter heavy by 1944. Speed, 32-33 knots. Flight deck length, 872-890 feet. Short/long hulls. US-17 Essexes during WRI, plus CVLs and CVEs. Carrier numbers ballooned beyond 100 by 1945. Japan, one new armored carrier, Taiho, commissioned in 1944, sunk the same year. Shinano, converted from a battleship hull, was sunk by submarine on her maiden voyage in November 1944. While America launched carriers faster than Japan could sink them, Japan launched carriers that couldn't even survive their shakedown cruises. It's tempting to think all Essexes were identical. They weren't. Early ships like Essex and Yorktown had a shorter bow, while later ones, such as Ticonderoga, featured a longer flight deck clipper bow. Anti-aircraft armament was continuously upgraded. Radar fits and air groups evolved. By late 1944, many Essexes carried 40-plus F-6F Hellcats, 36 SB-2C Helldivers, and 1824 TBF/TBM Avengers. The invincible Essex image is also misleading. Several were heavily damaged, Franklin nearly destroyed, Bunker Hill gutted by kamikazes. Their survival owed to design, crew discipline, and America's massive repair capacity, not immunity. By 1943, Japanese Naval General Staff reports privately acknowledged the impossible math. Even if U.S. carriers were sunk at Midway's pace, America's shipyards were launching replacements faster. One paraphrased officer wrote, "The enemy grows stronger the more we fight." Admiral Ugaki's diary entries lamented not only the loss of pilots, but also the futility of contesting a production line that rolled carriers out like sausages, as one post-war Japanese admiral bitterly described. The irony was absolute. The Japan's naval planners believed Pearl Harbor had bought them time to consolidate a Pacific empire. Instead, it gave America cause to unleash its industry. Carriers had been mocked as fragile auxiliaries. By 1944, the Essex-Class had become the steel core of Task Force 58/38, projecting power across the largest ocean in the world. In less than 2 years, the U.S. Navy had vaulted from 7 pre-war fleet carriers to a combined force of Essexes, CVLs, and CVEs numbering in the dozens. This was not just naval construction, it was industrial warfare. What Japanese officers once mocked as a tiny carrier fleet was transforming into a rolling armada. And ahead lay the proving grounds, the Marianas, the Philippines, and the day the skies would be filled with Hellcats, in what pilots would call the turkey shoot. June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea, hundreds of Japanese aircraft roared toward the U.S. fleet. From the decks of Essex-Class carriers, Hellcats clawed into the sky to meet them. Hours later, American pilots would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By 1943, the Essex-Class had begun to arrive in force. When H.M. Chester Nimitz pushed across the Central Pacific, these new fleet carriers spearheaded the leapfrogging advance. From the Gilberts to the Marshalls, then to the Marianas, the pattern was clear: amphibious landings, shielded and supported by massive carrier airstrikes. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher became the most powerful naval striking force in history to that point. Composed of Essex-Class fleet carriers and Independence-Class CVLs, it projected air power on a scale no nation had ever matched. The Marianas Campaign in June 1944, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, was decisive. The Japanese combined fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, sortied with the mobile fleet, 9 carriers, though most were depleted of experienced aviators. The U.S. countered with about 15 fast carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers with roughly 1,000 aircraft. Of the fleet carriers, most were Essex-Class, alongside the veteran Enterprise. On 19 June, Ozawa launched a massive strike. waves totaling over 300 aircraft. Radar aboard the carriers detected them far out. Hellcats rose in squadrons, guided by fighter direction officers. The result was slaughter. By day's end, U.S. pilots claimed more than 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed, against the loss of only about 30 Hellcat. Pilots' voices crackled over radios. "It's a turkey shoot." The phrase stuck. For Japan, the battle was a catastrophe. For America, it confirmed that Essex-Class carriers and trained aviators had achieved overwhelming superiority. TF-58 action reports detailing fighter direction, kill claims, and radar vectors. Pilot debriefings, many noting exhaustion from the sheer number of interceptions. Japanese records showing not only aircraft losses, but also the irreplaceable loss of veteran pilots. Just 4 months later, in October 1944, the Essex-Class Armada fought in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Task Force 38, the Erie's fast carriers under HDM William Bull Halsey, Koyald, fielded about 14 fast carriers, Fleet CV and Light, CVL combined, with roughly 1,100 aircraft. Against them, the Japanese Northern Force under Ozawa put forward Zoikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, and 3 light carriers. Critically, these carriers carried only a handful of planes. They were bait. On 25 October, U.S. carrier aircraft pounced. Zuikaku, already battle-worn, took multiple bomb and torpedo hits and capsized, her crew singing the old Kido Butai battle hymn as she went down. Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho were also sunk. With them, Japan's carrier force ceased to exist. Meanwhile, the kamikaze appeared in organized fashion for the first time. At Leyte, a kamikaze struck and sank the escort carrier St. Lo, COCM-63, heralding a new desperate phase. Philippine Sea, USA losses, -130 aircraft, 76 aircrew. Japanese losses, -315, 400 aircraft, plus the carriers Hayo and several oilers. Leyte Gulf. Japanese losses included 1 fleet carrier, Zuikaku, and 3 light carriers, Chitose, Chiyoda. U.S. carrier forces at Leyte, 14 fleet carriers, 1,000, 100 aircraft. Japanese carrier aircraft at Leyte, 100 serviceable aircraft across Ozawa's force. Kamikaze debut, St. Lo sunk, Gambier Bay lost to surface action. Both were escort carriers, CEVs, not Essex-Class. U.S. fast carrier force, dozens of carriers, coordinated radar direction, trained air groups. IJN mobile fleet. Hollowed-out carriers, many with fewer than 20 operational aircraft each, flown by undertrained pilots. The contrast was so stark that Japanese carriers, once the terror of the Pacific, became decoys, sacrificial bait to lure Halsey north, while surface forces attempted to strike U.S. invasion shipping. Here was the final irony. The fleet that had launched Pearl Harbor's carriers now used its last carriers as expendable lures. From symbols of naval power, they had become pawns in a desperate gamble, and the Essex-Class, mocked as America's toys in 1941, now dominated an ocean. Kamikazes sank Essexes wholesale. False. Not a single Essex was sunk in WRI. Several were badly damaged, Franklin and Bunker Hill most severely, but all survived. Leyte Gulf ended carrier warfare. Misleading. While surface actions at Samar and Surigao were dramatic, it was the carrier air power of TF-38 that destroyed Japan's last carriers and suppressed Japanese movements throughout. Though not lost at Leyte, Franklin, CV-13 Vada, later suffered near-fatal damage in March 1945 when bombs detonated fueled planes on her deck. Nearly 800 sailors were killed. Damage control reports described fires hot enough to melt steel plating and men throwing armed bombs overboard by hand. Yet Franklin survived, towed to safety, rebuilt, and returned. Her ordeal underscored both vulnerability and resilience. Japanese diaries from Leyte describe despair. One pilot wrote, "Our carriers rise with no planes to launch. We are ghosts." Ozawa himself, watching Zukaku sink, wept openly, acknowledging that the sword of Kido Butai, forged over decades, had shattered forever. By late 1944, Essex-Class carriers operated in task groups of 4 to 6, each with 300 to 400 aircraft. Multiple groups rotated within TF-38, enabling continuous operations. It was industrialized air warfare. One group striking, one recovering, another preparing. An endless cycle Japan could not match. The operational tempo was astonishing. In October 1944, TF-38 launched thousands of sorties in support of Leyte landings, crippling Japanese airbases across Luzon and Formosa. The Central Pacific campaigns, culminating in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, proved the Essex-Class Armada unstoppable. Japan's once feared carrier force was reduced to bait, its pilots slaughtered in the skies. From mock toys to the decisive arm of the Pacific War, Essex-Class carriers now ruled the ocean. Ahead lay Okinawa and the kamikaze storm. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. March 19, 1945, off Japan's coast, USS Franklin shuddered as 2 bombs tore into her flight deck. The blast hurled burning planes skyward, turning the carrier into a furnace, adrift. By spring 1945, Japan had no fleet left to contest the seas. Yamato had been destroyed in Operation Tengo. The last carriers lay at the bottom. What remained was desperation, the kamikaze, or divine wind. Organized under Adma Matome Ugaki, the kamikaze campaign sought to turn pilots themselves into weapons. The Okinawa campaign became the crucible. Beginning in April, waves of suicide aircraft descended on the Allied fleet in 10 mass offensives known as Kikusui floating chrysanthemums. After-action reports detail the shock. On April 6-7, nearly 400 kamikaze sorties were launched. Over 20 ships were hit in 2 days. The documents note the suddenness of impact. Radar tracks vanished as planes plunged directly onto decks. Damage crumple logs describe chaos, fuel fires, exploding ordnance, and men dragging hoses through smoke-filled corridors. USS Franklin, CV-13, was operating off Honshu in March, weeks before Okinawa. A Japanese bomber penetrated cloud cover and dropped 2 500-pound bombs. They hit squarely on her crowded flight deck, igniting fueled planes and ordnance. The results were apocalyptic. Explosions tore through the hangar, temperatures soared past 1,000 degrees, and aircraft were blown into the sea. Nearly 800 sailors were killed. Numbers vary: 724 KIA/265 WIA in some official tallies. Others cite 807 KIA/487 WIA. Yet Franklin did not sink. Her crew fought flames for hours, others jettisoned bombs by hand. She limped back to Ulithi and eventually to the U.S. West Coast, rebuilt at enormous cost. The irony: what Japan saw as a triumph only highlighted American depth. Even when an Essex was nearly annihilated, it returned. From April to June 1945, Task Force 58 supported the Okinawa landings. Essex decks launched continuous strikes against Japanese airfields on Kyushu and the Ryukyus. In response, kamikaze waves slammed into the fleet. Kikusui, IS-6 kamikaze sorties, dozens of hits. Kikusui to X-Across, April-June, ~1,000, 800, 1,900 kamikaze aircraft committed. In total, the Okinawa campaign cost the U.S. Navy 36 ships sunk and Tilde 368 damaged. Most were destroyers, picket ships, and smaller craft. The fast carriers, shielded by radar pickets and fighter screens, absorbed fewer hits, but when they were struck, the damage was severe. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, suffered one of the worst kamikaze hits of the war on May 11, 1945. 2 aircraft dove into her deck within 30 seconds, igniting fuel and ordnance. Fires raged for hours. 389 were killed, 264 wounded. Like Franklin, Bunker Hill survived scarred but afloat. She would never see combat again, but her survival underscored the resilience of the Essex design. Okinawa Campaign. 36 U.S. ships sunk, Tilde 368 damaged. Kamikaze sorties, Tilde 1,800 1,900, across 10 Kikusui. Offensives, Franklin casualties, 724, 807 KIA, 265, 487 WIA. Source ranges. Bunker Hill casualties, 389 KIA, 264 WIA. Essex speed, even when damaged, crews often restored partial operations within days or weeks. Japanese tactic: expend men and machines in one-way dives, betting on psychological and attritional shock. American response: layered defense, radar, CAP, Hellcats, AA guns, plus damage control training and forward repair bases, Ulithi, Guam, Pearl. The contrast wasn't just technological, it was cultural. Japanese pilots were trained for death. American sailors were trained to keep fighting through fire and steel. Japan believed the kamikaze would break U.S. morale, forcing a negotiated peace. Instead, the attacks hardened resolve. The Essexes proved impossible to destroy outright. Every suicide plane that hit was tragedy, but the carriers endured, repaired, and returned. The divine wind that once saved Japan from Mongol fleets in the 13th century now dissipated against industrial steel. The Essex-Class were invincible. Wrong, they were vulnerable. Franklin and Bunker Hill prove it. What made them endure was not magic, but compartmentalization, trained crews, and America's logistics. Kamikazes were unstoppable. Wrong. Radar-zegated fighter screens destroyed the majority before they reached targets. Successes were costly exceptions, not the rule. Indugaki's diary captured the desperation. On August 15, hours after the surrender announcement, he launched one final kamikaze sortie. Knowing it was futile, "We throw lives at steel," he wrote earlier, "but steel does not break." Pilots who survived early kamikaze waves recalled bitterly that they had been ordered into suicide, while their leaders remained behind. The strategy eroded morale as much as it inflicted damage. Behind the carriers lay an invisible armada, oilers, repair ships, tenders. At Ulithi Atoll, crippled Essexes received emergency patching within days. Pearl Harbor's yards, spared on 7 December 1941, now returned carriers to sea at astonishing speed. The Franklin, gutted in March, survived to prove the point. One carrier could suffer losses worse than any Japanese ship endured, and still be salvageable. By summer 1945, the kamikaze storm had bloodied the U.S. fleet, but failed to change the trajectory of war. Essex-class carriers, though scarred, remained afloat and fighting. Japan's final weapon, pilots turned into bombs, could not overcome steel, discipline, and America's industrial depth. The irony was bitter. The nation that mocked carriers as fragile toys now sacrificed thousands of men against them only to watch the toys steam unbroken toward the home islands. July 24, 1945. Over Kure, More than 1,300 U.S. carrier sorties darkened the skies. Below, Japan's last ships sat immobile, fuel tanks dry, crews helpless. By summer 1945, Japan had lost the ability to contest the seas. The Philippines were gone, Iwo Jima secured, Okinawa taken. The U.S. Navy's fast carrier task forces now roamed at will, launching raids directly against Japan's heartland. Task Force 38, commanded by A.D. William Bull Halsey and A.D.M. John S. Slew McCain Sr., anchored this power. Essex-Class carriers formed its core, rotating in and out of operations to maintain relentless pressure. Where once the Japanese had mocked America's tiny, flat-top fleet, now an armada of fast carriers, CVs and CVLs, complemented by scores of escort carriers, CVVs, crowded the Pacific horizon, often over a dozen fast carriers operating in rotation. Operational diaries from July 1945 record staggering numbers. On 24 July alone, TF-38 launched 1,374 sorties, striking Kure Naval Arsenal and surrounding bases. The Japanese battleship Haruna, already battered, was finished off in harbor. Heavy cruiser Tone went down beside her. Sinspac's monthly summaries confirm the relentless scale, hundreds of sorties per day, flattening airfields, factories, and shipping. The Essexes were now instruments of strategic strangulation. By VJ Day, 17 Essex-Class carriers had been commissioned, with 14 seeing combat. Counting CVLs and CVEs, the U.S. operated over 100 carriers of all types by 1945. TF-38/58 could field 1,300 aircraft in a single mass strike. Sortie peaks: 24 July 1945, 1,300 plus launched against Kure. Japanese fuel reserves had collapsed to a small fraction of pre-war levels. Operational sorties often fell under 100 per day by mid-1945. United States. Carriers that never ceased striking, replenished at sea by oilers and supply ships. Japan. Capital ships trapped in port, unable to sortie for lack of fuel and trained pilots. Where once the Kido Butai had struck Pearl Harbor across 3,000 miles, its remnants now sat rusting at anchor, targets for Hellcats and Hell Divers. The sinking of Yamato in April 1945 epitomized the collapse. Escorted by minimal forces, she sailed south on a one-way suicide run, Operation 10 Go, to contest Okinawa. Wave after wave of Essex-launched aircraft pounded her with bombs and torpedoes until she rolled and exploded. The largest battleship in history had been destroyed by air power alone. This event underscored the new reality. Carriers, not battleships, dictated survival. Japanese diaries revealed despair. A civilian in Tokyo wrote of skies dense with planes by mid-1945. Naval officers confessed their impotence. A captured staff officer summarized, "We have ships, but no fuel. Planes, but no pilots. Bases, but no defense." Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, facing impossible odds, privately admitted in July that the empire had no path left but surrender, though militarists clung to hopes of inflicting enough casualties to gain terms. It is tempting to imagine that Task Force 38 launched 1,000 plane raids every day. The truth is more nuanced. The Navy did not maintain that tempo continuously. Instead, specific peaks reached over 1,300. Sorties, e.g. 24 July. Operational rhythm varied with weather, logistics, and fuel availability. Another misconception: that 24 Essexes fought Japan in 1945. In reality, 17 Essex-Class were commissioned by VJ Day, with 14 in combat zones. The full 24 would only be reached by 1950. Behind the striking power of the Essexes was a vast support train. Fleet oilers, repair ships, tenders, and ammunition barges enabled TF-38 to operate indefinitely at sea. Japanese planners, still thinking in terms of decisive fleet actions and secure bases, could not comprehend this mobility. At Ulithi Atoll, damaged carriers were patched in days. At Pearl Harbor and West Coast yards, they were rebuilt in months. The Japanese had no equivalent. Their damaged ships, once forced into port, rarely emerged again. The irony was brutal. Japan had begun the war by proving carriers could cripple a fleet at anchor. By 1945, America's Essex-Class had turned that lesson back on its teacher, this time with overwhelming numbers. Japanese carriers ended the war as bait or as burned-out hulks. Their last great surface units died at anchor. The very concept of the decisive battle, the Kantai-Kessen, was inverted. Instead of a single-gun duel, the war ended in a grinding series of carrier raids that no surface fleet could withstand. July 24, 28, 1945. Task Force 38 concentrated on Kure. Essex-class carriers launched strikes that sank or disabled. Battleship Haruna. Heavy cruiser Tone. Several light cruisers and destroyers. Dozens of merchant ships. Japanese air defenses were token. Records note fewer than 50 effective sorties launched in defense. For a navy that once massed 400 aircraft at Pearl Harbor, the collapse was total. Post-war Japanese naval historians admitted the futility. One wrote, "We were being bombarded by factories at sea. The carriers, rotating fresh squadrons and crews, never allowed breathing room." Ugaki's final diary entry before launching his own kamikaze sortie on August 15 read, "The war is lost. The gods have abandoned us." By August 1945, the Essex-class Armada had erased Japan's strategic options. What began with laughter at America's toy carriers ended with skies filled by an unstoppable rolling thunder. Japan's surface fleet no longer fought at sea. It died in its own harbors. The empire was overrun not by battleships or blockades, but by the decks of Essex-class carriers, whose aircraft reached into the very heart of Japan. Today, 4 Essex-class carriers still sit moored as museums: Intrepid, Yorktown, Hornet, and Lexington, outliving every Japanese carrier that once mocked them. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Essex-class stood triumphant. 17 had been commissioned during the war, 14 had reached the front, and not a single one had been lost. Their decks had carried the Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor's ashes to Tokyo Bay's surrender. But their story did not end with victory. In the uneasy dawn of the Cold War, the Essexes were reimagined for a new age. The SCB-27 and SCB-125 modernization programs gutted and rebuilt many Essex hulls. New angled flight decks, reinforced structures, and jet-capable catapults turned WII workhorses into Cold War fleet carriers. By the 950S, Essexes launched F-9F Panthers and F-2H Banshees in Korea. In the 1960S, they flew A-4 Skyhawks and F-8 Crusaders in Vietnam. Numbers matter. 24 Essex-class carriers commissioned by 1950. Roughly 1415 underwent major SCB-27/125 modernizations. Several served into the 1970S. The adaptability of the Essex design meant they bridged the gap until supercarriers like the Forrestal class arrived. Naval Historical Center Modernization Records. Documents of CB-27/125 conversions. Korean War Action Reports. Essexes providing close air support at Incheon, Hungnam. Vietnam-era squadron logs. Hornet, Ticonderoga, Oriskany, conducting strikes into Southeast Asia. By the Cold War, the Essexes were no longer America's capital ships. The supercarrier era, Forrestal, Kitty Hawk, Enterprise, CVN 65, took primacy. Essexes shifted into support, training, and anti-submarine roles. Yet their longevity proved the design's flexibility. Longest-serving Essex, USS Lexington, CV-16, active 1943-1991 as a training carrier. Combat service spans WRA-Korea-Vietnam. Preservation. 4 museum ships today: Intrepid, Yorktown, Hornet, Lexington. Visitors. Millions annually. Walk-in decks once blackened by war. Essexes, after WRI, modernized, serving into the jet age. 4. Preserved as museums. IJN carriers, after WAI, every Japanese fleet carrier destroyed in combat, none preserved. The nation that mocked American carriers saw its own vanish utterly, while Essexes endured for decades beyond their war. In 1941, Japanese staff officers dismissed America's carrier fleet as negligible. By 1945, Essex-Class carriers had smothered Japan's navy and homeland. By 1950, they were still frontline ships. Even into the 1,970s, they flew jet squadrons while Japan's surviving naval aviation existed only in textbooks and memory. Post-war Japanese naval historians admitted the scale of the reversal. One observed, "We built masterpieces for single battles. The Americans built factories that produced ships without end. In the end, we lost not to strategy, but to industry." This concession underscores the Essex legacy, not just ships, but symbols of industrial warfighting. The Essexes were invincible. Wrong. Several were nearly lost, Franklin, Bunker Hill, but survived through design and damage control. They would be the only one alone. Wrong. Submarines strangled Japan's commerce. B-29S burned its cities. Yet, Essexes provided the indispensable mobile airfields that broke Japanese sea power. Only WI relics. Wrong. Essexes became Cold War warriors, training carriers, and museums, bridging generations of naval aviation. Today, visitors walk the decks of USS Yorktown in Charleston, South Carolina. Commissioned in 1943, she fought at Truk, the Marianas, Leyte, and Okinawa. She later served in Vietnam and recovered Apollo 8 in 1968. Her museum placards tell a layered story: WI combat, Cold War adaptation, and space-age recovery missions, all from one Essex hull. The Essex-Class was more than a warship. It was an idea. Industrial scale turned into floating airfields, adaptable across decades. From Pearl Harbor's empty berths to Tokyo Bay's surrender, from Korea's frozen harbors to Vietnam's jungles, and finally into quiet museums, the Essexes carried history on their decks. They began as the ships Japan laughed at, dismissing America's tiny carrier fleet. They ended as monuments to endurance, outliving every adversary, still visited today by those who walk their steel decks and hear echoes of a war once decided by them.